Over the past couple weeks, Andy Ruiz has posted pictures on his social media of him next to people like Michael Hunter and Gerald Washington. He's apparently been sparring both of them, among others. People have been asking my opinion on the quality of Anthony Joshua's sparring partners in comparison to Ruiz's. Well, when it comes to sparring partners, it's not necessarily about the quality all the time. I mean, look, having the best quality sparring partners is usually the best thing. But it's also about trying to get sparring partners who replicate the opponent you're about to face, or come somewhat close to replicating the opponent you're about to face stylistically, maybe even in terms of their dimensions. So, for example, in a hypothetical universe, if you were going to fight Mike Tyson, you wouldn't bring in Vitaly Klitschko to spar with, would you? Mike Tyson's 5'10", Vitaly Klitschko's 6'7", totally different styles. You'd need a totally different approach. You'd need to practice totally different things. You'd actually be better off bringing in Derek Chisora as a sparring partner to help you prepare for Mike Tyson rather than Vitaly Klitschko. Because even though Vitaly Klitschko is better than Derek Chisora, stylistically, Chisora is way closer to Tyson. He's obviously nowhere near as good as Tyson, but stylistically way closer to him than Vitaly Klitschko is. And so the Chisora sparring would help you far more than the Vitaly Klitschko sparring. Okay? So for Andy Ruiz, he's got Michael Hunter. Personally, I think that sparring is going to benefit Hunter more so than Ruiz, because Ruiz is far closer stylistically to Alexander Povetkin than Hunter is stylistically to AJ. So I think it's great sparring in general. Hunter and Ruiz, and they did fight as amateurs. Hunter won that. But it's going to benefit Hunter more, because as I say, stylistically, Povetkin and Ruiz are somewhat similar. Same with the dimensions. I think Povetkin's probably quicker on his feet than Ruiz. Ruiz got quicker hands, but they're both good at countering on the front foot. Povetkin tends to lead off a little bit more than Ruiz, but there's similarities there, so that's good sparring, more so for Hunter. For Ruiz, I mean, is Hunter anything like AJ? Not really. As far as him sparring Gerald Washington, yes. In terms of dimensions, Washington is very similar to Anthony Joshua. Very similar. Of course, he doesn't have the power of AJ, doesn't have the all-round skill of AJ, doesn't have really anything that AJ has other than his size and dimensions and whatnot, and maybe a bit of athleticism. But still, when it comes to target practice and just learning how to cut the distance off, not that Gerald Washington can move around the ring as well as AJ, but still, for general target practice with somebody who's trying to hit you back, yes, Gerald Washington is a fairly decent person to get in for preparation against Anthony Joshua. Now, as far as AJ's sparring partners and whether they stack up to Ruiz's, I think Derek Chisora is the best stylistically. He's around the same height as Ruiz. These days, he's not too far off in terms of weight either. Doesn't have as quick a hands as Ruiz. I suspect his feet might be even a bit faster than Ruiz's feet. Moves his head more than Ruiz does when he's coming in, and he's more active than Ruiz. Ruiz is really a front foot counter puncher. Derek Chisora is more of a volume puncher. So there are differences stylistically, and I don't know how much work AJ's actually done with Derek Chisora. Okay? I know they have sparred, and of course they sparred way back in the days when they were both at Finchley ABC. But if he only did a week of sparring with Chisora, I mean, that's not ideal, really. You'd like Chisora in for several weeks to give Anthony Joshua, the most benefit out of that situation. But Chisora is not a bad sparring partner at all to get in if you're fighting Andy Ruiz, because he will bring a lot of pressure. And one of the key points in this rematch, I think, will be Anthony Joshua's stamina. Can his stamina hold up? Derek Chisora in sparring is going to attack you. He's going to hit you to the body. He's going to put you under intense pressure, probably more pressure than Ruiz is going to put you under, because Chisora tends to take more chances. He's going to give you more opportunity to hit him as well, of course, and he's not going to be so fast on the counter, Chisora. But still, it's decent sparring. Andrew Tabiti, he is a cruiserweight. Last time I saw him, he got knocked out cold by Junior Dorticus. And look, you do sometimes bring guys in for speed, not necessarily to replicate the opponent's style, but just to sharpen up your reflexes. And maybe that's what AJ's brought Tabiti in for. Because again, Tabiti stylistically is absolutely nothing like Andy Ruiz Jr. Nothing like him at all. Tabiti is a boxer puncher, totally different style, moves around the ring. For a big guy like AJ, it's probably a little difficult to pin Tabiti down. So that's probably what he's brought him in for. Then he's got this guy called Timothy Moulton. I'd never heard of this Moulton guy, much less seen him before, up until it was announced he was one of AJ's sparring partners. I went online and had a look at a couple of his fights. He's 5'10". He's very heavy, similar kind of physique to Andy Ruiz, but looks nowhere near as talented as Ruiz. I'm not sure how useful this guy is going to be in sparring, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. Tom Little, who's a well-known domestic or area level fighter in the UK. Again, how much can Tom Little really bring to the table for AJ? Doesn't really have the same dimensions as Andy Ruiz either. And interestingly, Tom Little was on a podcast recently with Dylan White's quote unquote brother, among other people. And he said that based upon his recent experiences sparring Anthony Joshua and Dylan White, he would actually favor Dylan White in a rematch right now because he believes White is the more improved fighter of the two. He says he likes both of them. He's pals with both, but he thinks that Dylan White would probably win if they fought again right now. Although, he said it while while Dylan White's quote unquote brother was sat right next to him. So, make it out what you will. Then we have this guy, Albon Pervisage. I know I'm butchering that name, people. I've looked him up. There's a clip of one of his fights here. And this is his box rec. He's 12-1, 9 KOs. He looks fairly fast-handed. Can cover the distance. He's aggressive. Obviously, I'm not saying this is an elite heavyweight, but from a stylistic point of view, in the generic sense, you can see why he would be utilized for this particular camp. So, I get it. I get why they brought this guy in from what I've seen of him. Does have pretty quick hands. Throws combinations and all that kind of stuff, which is what Andy Ruiz is going to do. You're never going to get somebody who's going to be exactly like your opponent. Or very rarely anyway. You're very rarely going to be able to do that. So, and it's going to sound strange, but for this fight here, it's really not so much about the sparring as it would be for the first fight. Because AJ's been in the ring with Ruiz before. He knows what Ruiz is like. He knows how hard he punches. He knows how fast he is. He knows what moves he makes. So in his head, he knows very well what it's going to be like to be in there against Andy Ruiz. So for me, the sparring here is more about AJ being in the right place mentally, sharpening his tools, of course, his defense, his offense, his movement, stamina, all that kind of stuff. But it's a mental battle more than anything, in my view, for Anthony Joshua going into this Ruiz rematch. Because AJ is being written off by a lot of people going into this rematch, and I'll talk about that in a separate video and what it really means, okay? But with regards to the sparring, just to give you some examples, okay? Because people are going to make the assumption that top-level heavyweights always spar quality sparring partners. Not always the case. Now, there have been some historic examples. Sonny Liston was sparring George Foreman. George Foreman was kind of the prodigy of Liston. So that was obviously great. Muhammad Ali was sparring Larry Holmes for years and years and years. Holmes then went on to become champion after, Ali, his career wound down. Joe Frazier also had Larry Holmes as a sparring partner. But then you had Mike Tyson, when he was champion in the 80s, he didn't have a roster of A-level sparring partners for most of his fights. It was mostly fringe contenders and journeymen that Mike Tyson had as sparring partners in his prime. So, for example, Mike Tyson regularly sparred Mike Jameson, who was one of his victims. And I'm talking about in-the-ring victims here, people. Mike Jameson was a regular in Mike Tyson camps. Jesse Ferguson, another one of his former opponents, was a regular in Mike Tyson camps. James Broad. Again, these are fringe contenders, people. These are not elite level heavyweights of the time. James Broad, he did have Greg Page in for a couple camps. And Greg Page was a former world heavyweight champion. But again, by the time Tyson had him in, Page was, kind of over the hill. He'd seen better days. And probably most famously for prime Tyson, he was sparring Oliver McCall. But again, at the time, McCall was seen as a journeyman. This is what people don't understand now. This was not the McCall who, later went on to beat Lennox Lewis and have a brief reign as WBC heavyweight champion. No, this was McCall who was losing to people like Buster Douglas, when even Douglas himself was classed as a fringe contender / journeyman. That wasn't a close fight, by the way. Buster Douglas versus Oliver McCall. So McCall wasn't a big name in the heavyweight division at the time when Tyson was sparring him. Yeah, so Tyson didn't have elite level sparring partners in his camp in his prime. And when Tyson came out of prison, his level of sparring partners was even worse. And not to say they were terrible, because look, people like Jesse Ferguson and Oliver McCall gave Mike some good work. But after prison, the level of Tyson's sparring partners was horrible for the most part. Terrible. You go research it, P. Terrible. Then you've got people like Evander Holyfield. One of Holyfield's main sparring partners was, God, I forgot the guy's name. He was a black American guy, light-skinned guy with a hairy chest, about 6'1". When he first was rising up through the ranks as a contender, he tried to copy the Mike Tyson style and the Mike Tyson look with the black shorts and the black boots, as so many fighters did back then. Can't remember the guy's name. Oh, was it Gary Bell? I think his name might have been Gary Bell. But he was one of Evander Holyfield's main sparring partners for years. Gary Bell. And he wasn't a very good fighter. Got knocked out by David Tua in the first round, I remember. Holyfield did have Tua in for the Mike Tyson camp. That was one of the better sparring partners that Holyfield had in. But trust me, Holyfield sparred plenty of people when he was a heavyweight throughout his heavyweight campaign who were not top-level fighters at all, or even close. Okay? Lennox Lewis, another one. Lewis regularly sparred people like Maurice Harris, a journeyman. Regularly sparred people like Garing Lane. He sparred Jeremy Williams. He sparred, what's the guy called now? Cedric Boswell, who Povetkin knocked out a few years ago. That shows you how old Boswell was at the time. Okay? How far Boswell goes back. Malik Scott was a Lennox Lewis sparring partner. Jamil McCline. These people who were sparring Lennox Lewis were not elite level heavyweights for the most part. They were sparring partner material. They were guys who made the bulk of their living sparring, not actually fighting. Yeah? Lewis wasn't sparring the who's who, the heavyweight division, when he was champion. That's relatively rare in the history of heavyweight boxing. Yeah? A lot of the time, these top champions are not sparring great fighters. But yet they still manage to go in the ring and perform and produce the goods. Yeah? So sparring is obviously very good, and the better the quality of the sparring, usually the more benefit you're going to get from it. Although sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you can get a top-level sparring partner in, maybe somebody who's a world champion, and he might give you the business in sparring. He might beat the crap out of you to the point where you're actually damaged going into the fight. I've talked about this in recent videos. So, anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. That's my take on Anthony Joshua's sparring partners ahead of the Ruiz rematch. I don't think there's any issue there, really, because the only person I would say who they really should have tried to get in for sparring for AJ would be Alexander Povetkin. I think that is by far and away the best, the best fighter to get in to most closely replicate what Andy Ruiz is going to do. And maybe they have got Povetkin in. Just because it hasn't been announced, it doesn't mean they haven't got it. Yeah? I'm not saying that they have either, okay? So don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. But point being, there's a lot of misdirection in boxing. And maybe Anthony Joshua and Eddie Hearn are learning to employ more misdirection than they have in the past. Maybe they've realized that they've made a mistake in revealing their hand too often. Maybe they're going to take a leaf out of Andy Ruiz's book. He used misdirection, right? Playing Mr. Nice Guy and lulling Anthony Joshua into a full sense of security and rocking him to sleep in that first fight. Maybe they've learned some misdirection. Maybe they've got Povetkin in. I don't know. Yeah. Surely AJ and his team if they had any sense about him at all, would have paid top dollar to ensure Povetkin was in their camp. And maybe they want to keep it quiet. Maybe they want Ruiz to think that he hasn't had a good camp, that he hasn't had good prep. You know? It's a mind game at this point. Sometimes it's not just to do with how well you train and how hard you've trained. It's where your mind is at. Are you expecting a tough fight, or are you expecting a guy to capitulate? Yeah? It's like when, I'll go into it in a separate video, but when Ruiz rematched Hasim Ratman, many Americans at the time, most of the American press, were expecting Ruiz to capitulate. Mentally, not just physically. Talk about that in a separate vid. Let me know how you guys think in the comment section below, what you're thinking about all the points I've raised in this video. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.